All right, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay out there? Yes? Okay. And I'm looking, somewhere I'm on a video and we're looking at Zoom. So we're also simulcasting this lecture tonight in Zoom. So I don't see a Zoom window, so I have no idea how many people are watching, but I'm sure it's hundreds and thousands of people out there are Zooming in tonight. My name is Derek Hefferlin. I'm the Architecture and Urban Design program here at Washington University in St. Louis. I am going to be very brief because I'm going to pass it over to Matthew Bernstein in a second. But I just wanted to say thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for to all of those on Zoom as well and around the world who are joining, which I'm excited about this lecture we're going to have as part of our Informal Cities Workshop. This is now in the, I believe, 8th year of the workshop. It's a very important aspect of our Master of Urban Design program, as those of you in the room know, because you're participating in this one-credit workshop. But it's super special this year because, of course, we're back in person, working together. We in the room in Steinberg Gallery just across the way, making already happening. So any of you else out there or who are watching from from St. Louis, feel free to come stop by this weekend to see all the work that's happening. The Informal Cities Workshop has been led for the past few years by Matthew Bernstein, who is a lecturer here in the Urban Design program. He's also an alum of this program. Matt is really important in our program. He teaches in each semester. He teaches also the correlating 3-credit Informal Cities seminar that he's been leading for a few years, as well as in the spring he teaches the Metropolitan Sustainability course, and he also teaches in the summer program in different capacities, either in the research course that supplements the studio or also in the studio itself during the summer. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Matt so he can introduce our esteemed guest this evening. Thank you.
Sorry, I just had to pull up my notes. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. And for those of you who are on Zoom, Derek said across the world. Hopefully that's so. I think we have about 25 people on Zoom, which is great. It's my pleasure to kick off the workshop tonight with our 8th year with Chelina Odbert. I'm going to try and be brief so that we can get to our guest. But just a bit about the Informal Cities Workshop. The lecture and master class would not be possible without the institutional and individual support of the many who are here tonight and probably listening. In particular, the Graduate Urban Design Program, the chair Derek Hefferlin for providing the support, the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts, and their very generous staff. Ellen Bailey in particular has assisted with many of the logistics and operations that go into this. And of course, the Divided City Initiative. Gene Allman and Bruce Lindsay have been instrumental in this in fact, workshop moving forward for many years. So their support has obviously been invaluable to the success and the longevity of the workshop. But tonight it is about the Informal Cities Workshop Kickoff. The master class is a 1-credit course. It's an entry into informal urbanism's processes, practices, and capacities. Each year it's led by a professional practicing who has deep firsthand knowledge and expertise and experience working within the context of informality. The study of and learning is critical to the design profession. Rapid urbanization and population growth currently outpace the construction of affordable and adequate housing. The UN estimates that over 1 billion people live within informality. And while there's much to unpack about the word informality and the terminology that's used, one thing is clear is that the operating models of inclusion have been woefully inadequate by any standard, both domestically and abroad. The masterclass is positioned to help learn from the processes of informal urbanism and how it's matured. It's in fact the only type of urbanism that has continuously increased since 1900. So this masterclass, although it's a brief window into the study, it's meant to expose the students to a critical area, an opportunity for our students and future designers into a mode of urbanism that's existed throughout the world. So in 3 short days, starting today, the students will be led through a design process that seeks to create gender-inclusive public spaces within 2 informal contexts, one in Mendoza, Argentina, and the other in Kibera, Nairobi, both of which I'm sure you will see tonight. While there's much to say about the work of KDI and under the leadership of Chelina, I'll give you the highlights, at least as I have come to know them. She's the co-founder and executive director of KDI. She believes in the potential of low-cost, high-impact design interventions to improve the physical, economic, and social quality of life in low-income communities. Her expertise covers a range of topics, including leadership, participatory planning, social entrepreneurship, urban development, environmental remediation, and social impact design. Quite a range of leadership tools and design expertise. She has extensive field experience in Africa, Latin America, and the US, and has notably worked on participatory planning and design projects in India, Brazil, Honduras, Haiti, Morocco. She's shaped KDI into an internationally recognized and award-winning design, planning, and community development firm. She lectures extensively around the world and writes about KDI's community engagement process and approach to planning and design. Additionally to all of those, she's been recognized by the Van Allen Institute, American Express, and the Aspen Institute for her work. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Claremont McKenna College and a Master's of Urban Planning from the GSD at Harvard University. So please help me welcome Chelina to the stage, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Is it okay to take this off? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So you can hear me better. All right. Well, good evening, and thank you, Sam Fox and Divided City colleagues, and a special thanks to Matt for inviting me to spend the weekend with all of you. Tonight, I'd like to begin a conversation about the informal city. The informal city that you know, and the ones that perhaps you don't. I imagine when I say informal settlement, most of us call up a very similar mental image. So let's see if that's right. Please raise your hand if any of the following images resemble that which came to your mind's eye when I said informal settlement. Okay, thanks. Now, how about these images? Show of hands, please, if yes. All right. Now, let's take a look at the definition to see if that helps anybody who's on the fence about whether these are informal or not. The UN defines an informal settlement as residential areas where inhabitants have insecure tenure, ranging everything from squatting to informal rental housing. These neighborhoods usually lack or are cut off from basic services and city infrastructure. And the housing in these settlements does not comply with current planning and building regulations, often situated in geographically and environmentally hazardous areas. Does that help? Are those informal? To answer the question, the answer is yes. Though perhaps these images are less familiar to us, each of the communities that I showed in South Texas, the Eastern Coachella Valley, and Los Angeles, in fact meet the definition given to us by the UN. And if we look a little closer at the fine print of that definition, we see that the UN too agrees with that assessment. So if you're like me, you may still be a bit suspicious. Sure, there are tough living conditions in the US, but they don't really compare to the, quote, slums of the global South. Well, I'd like to spend tonight showing you that they do. And I do this not to make a competition of who has things worse. Certainly such conditions, the byproducts of colonialism, racism, capitalism, and more, should not exist in the global South nor in the global North. Instead, I do this because that fallacy, that informal cities are faraway problems, makes the delivery of impactful design solutions all the more elusive. When the problem is framed in that far-off place sort of way, it tends to reinforce and exaggerate a kind of remoteness between the designer and the subject. Like any exotic narrative, this approach relies on assumptions and invented fictions. Designers can parachute in from afar. Projects can be one-offs, considered as charity rather than part of a firm's body of work. Solutions can be drawn simply from internet research. And in this framework, what can be overlooked is the expert voices of local residents and other stakeholders, and the designer's roles with respect to that expertise. Once we recognize that the injustice of informality exists in our own close-to-home context, then it becomes harder to objectify the residents of these settlements as voiceless strangers whose challenges we can presume to solve with our training and expertise. Instead, they become people in our own communities, those who have been forced into areas that our own governments have redlined, but they are our neighbors. Neighbors who live in neighborhoods without access to parks, without access to transportation, without access to safe housing, or in some cases, housing period. Now, this was certainly the case for KDI when we started over a decade ago. It was only through coming to better understand the nuances of informality through our own participatory work with residents in Kibera that we then came to recognize that communities in our very own backyard were facing many of the same challenges: lack of housing, essential services, lack of public spaces, and very few income-generating opportunities where they lived. So I want to take you through a bit of that comparison. First, in the informal city that we know. In this case, it's where our work started, perhaps the poster child of informal settlements, Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya. And as I introduce you to Kibera, I'll also introduce you to a settlement that you've likely never heard of, despite its location just a stone's throw away from this place. And then, of course, a crisis that you may know all too well, growing in cities across the country. And I do this so that you too might see the through line of inequity that transcends geography or development status. Okay, so on to Kibera. Colonialism, corruption, the prospect of urban jobs, unregulated capitalism, and government failure are all key contributors to Kibera's current living condition and its culture. The story goes something like this. During colonial rule, the land that would become Kibera was given to the Sudanese soldiers as a pension for their service in the British Army. This 1948 aerial shows the land that was given at the beginning of the Kibera settlement. And for orientation, you can see the Royal Nairobi Golf Course and Club, which currently marks the northern border of Kibera. So soon the British regretted that decision of giving that land to the Nubians and sought to take back the land because they now believed it to be too valuable and too close to the European settlements. But despite their best efforts, the colonial leaders couldn't demolish the settlement. And eventually, they agreed to tolerate Kibera, but vowed to make no investments in its development. They literally did this by leaving it off the map, as you can see here, where Kibera is left and marked as forest, and ignoring its existence and, importantly, ignoring its growth. So then Nairobi's population exploded following independence in 1963. Rural Kenyans migrated to the city in search of employment, and the new Kenyan government continued this policy of malicious neglect in Kibera, while also failing to provide additional housing. In 1969, they declared that all Kibera land was state property. and they granted permits to build in Kibera to the politically connected middle and upper class. So then these landlords began to build shacks and began to rent those shacks to poor migrant Kenyans. The rental economy was booming, and it continues to this day to be very lucrative for these landlords who, as we said, occupy the middle and upper class of Kenyan society. But because the government still owns the land, the fear of demolition is real. And so there's no incentive or pathway for these renters to invest in or improve these properties. And then that early settlement that you saw from 1948 over the course of 60 plus years has now become a full-fledged city in its own right. And again, there's the golf course for reference. So today, residents of Kibera make up much of the low-income workforce that powers the industrial and service sectors of Nairobi. And these demographics include immigrants from all over Kenya. They're families that have lived in Kibera for generations, alongside new arrivals from the rural area. And over 60% of these residents in Kibera are under 18. Okay, so what does it mean to live in Kibera? Access is often tough due to the steep topography and only a few paved roads. These streets and alleys, as you can see, are very narrow and can be dangerous, particularly at night with no lighting. Water supply is controlled by cartels. It's expensive, it's unregulated, and often unclean. Formal sanitation systems are largely non-existent. Food insecurity is pervasive. Open space is marginal at best. Nothing purpose-built before we began to work there. And housing, because of that lack of tenure, is made of temporary materials and precarious. But despite all of these challenges, and perhaps because of them, Kibera residents are resilient. They are entrepreneurial, they have strong community networks, and very high levels of participation in community groups. Now, when we think of Kibera and move to the other side of the world, in California's Coachella Valley, we see a similar story. The Coachella Valley extends about 45 miles north to south, and here colonialism is replaced by discrimination in the form of structural racism aimed at Native Americans and immigrants primarily. That plus complicated, and some might say corrupt, water rights systems all coalesce to create great disparity between the tourist-friendly West Valley, where Palm Springs, La Quinta, Indian Wells are located, and the agricultural East Valley. So the valley was first inhabited by native tribes, including the Kauia and Kokopa Band of Indians. And then in the early 1900s, the agricultural industry began to take root in the East Valley. And over time, a large influx of migrants, primarily from Mexico, came to pick the lettuce, harvest the dates, and package the citrus for export all over the country. And because the East Valley was largely seen as agricultural and there was no provision for farm worker housing, and the rents in the West Valley were far too high for a field worker to afford, residents had to create their own housing solutions. The most accessible option was to buy an old trailer and pay a landowner, often a landowner on unregulated tribal land, to be able to put their trailer there. And of course, these were unplanned communities without any infrastructure to connect to. And so over time, these unpermitted trailer parks have really become the dominant typology in the area. There are at least 150 of them at current count. So today, residents of the Eastern Coachella Valley continue to work in the fields, as well as the tourism industry in the region. But over 40% of the population in the East Valley lives 200% below the state poverty line. That's nearly double the rate of the rest of the state. So again, looking at some of these same categories of services, access in the Eastern Coachella Valley is challenged because there's almost no public transportation across this sprawling desert environment and an overwhelming number of paved roads. The East Valley also lacks a complete water infrastructure, so many places rely on wells, and those wells are often contaminated by arsenic. Sanitation varies, with some people connected to formal sewers, but others relying on less formal systems like sewage ponds or hand-dug pits below the trailers. And despite the abundance of commercial farms, access to fresh foods is extremely limited. And while there is an abundance of vacant land in the overall region, the Eastern Coachella Valley, too, lacks any formal public space prior to our work beginning there, which forced people to gather in dusty, vacant lots without any shelter from the brutal heat, temperatures often ranging in the 110s and 20s. And housing is in mobile homes that are long past their shelf life, with windows that don't operate, walls that aren't still holding together, and so a lot of kind of provisional repairs just to make these homes do the basic function of putting a roof over someone's head. So then the third place I'll introduce you to needs no introduction, of course, but it may need a bit of explanation, because the term informal cities itself suggests a kind of stable geography, that certain locations are either formal or informal, that it's an either-or condition. And though that can certainly be the case, as that dramatic adjacency between Kibera and the Royal Golf Course shows us, informality can also be more fluid than the term suggests. In Los Angeles, a city at the center of the US housing crisis, a city that would be considered resolutely formal by most people's standards, the experience of the city for far too many is decidedly informal. And despite what media coverage might suggest, this has been the case not for just the last few years, but for a very long time, which renders Los Angeles an informal city, at least in the experience of the unhoused. So for unhoused Angelenos, the city has failed to provide even the most basic services. Again, we see the challenges of access, provisional water supplies, improvised sanitation, again, a complete lack of food infrastructure, and of course, the same goes for housing infrastructure. In this situation, this housing is perhaps the most transitional and insecure of all of the places we've seen this evening. And while it would be reasonable to think that at the very least, the unhoused would have access to public space, we all know the stories of municipal legislation across the country that has become increasingly creative in their determination to restrict unhoused populations from public space, devising laws, rules, and other regulations to make it off limits to this community. So seen through this framework, the classifications and the connections between these geographies seem clear. So why are we so able and eager to see and solve the problems over there, and sometimes oblivious to their presence or our ability as designers to solve them here? Well, I would propose that part of the challenge of informal cities may have a lot to do with the term itself. As Matt said, there's a lot to unpack in the term. It's understood that with so-called formal cities, how most of us would define cities of the global north, we plan, we design, we manage. But for the informal parts, well, those are often thought to just kind of happen. They just spring up in leftover spaces that get occupied through time and through forces beyond anyone's control. But this passive type of chain of events belies the very active way that informal cities are actively designed and planned both abroad and close to home. Wherever they are located, through unjust policies and inequitable design and planning strategies, informal cities are actively created here, and we as design professionals are often complicit. Understood this way, if designers and planners have been part of the problem, it follows that we must reorient how we practice, not to only ensure that we do no more harm, but that we also take active roles in rendering these inequities obsolete. And so as a point of departure, I'd like to propose 4 ways of moving into that challenge and illustrate them through 4 or 5 of our projects. So in our practice, which is a nonprofit, mission-driven practice, we do all of these things. But I'd like to assert that any practice, for-profit, traditional, can do this in their own way. So the 4 ways that we'll talk about tonight are broadening decision-making. We can broaden decision-making power, connect our design interventions to policy change, layer those interventions with multiple benefits and scales, and then spend more time doing research and sharing data. So let's look at the first move, broadening decision-making power. So one of the principal causes of informal cities are the racist, colonialist, and otherwise exclusionary approaches to decision-making that I've been mentioning. But essentially it comes down to this: top-down decisions implemented without community input or involvement. That leads to outcomes that very rarely reflect the real priorities and visions of the end users of these interventions. Perhaps the only thing that we understood when we started KDI as students in Kibera was that the only way we could be useful as budding designers there would be if we were guided by those that knew the place, the people, and the problem better than us. And that early idea, as you saw in that diagram, has really become the foundation of our practice. All of our projects reorient the decision-making structure to center voices and knowledge that typically go unheard in a design and planning process. So our first project as a firm, and also our longest running, the Kibera Public Space Project, is a good example of that. What we learned in our first 2 weeks of working with residents in Kibera is that there was both a long list of challenges and a very short list of vacant land in which you might address those challenges. We also learned that any physical intervention should be paired with a built-in income generating strategy because folks didn't have disposable income that would be available to maintain these spaces. And without that, and without government support, anything we did physically would have little chance of survival over the long run. So this led us to the idea of productive public space. Essentially, these are waste spaces reclaimed along the riverine corridors that cut through the settlement. They're spaces that were previously deemed unbuildable, used for dumping and a range of other illicit activities, that then could be reclaimed and then layered, not just with passive recreation spaces, but a range of other physical and environmental amenities, social programs, and economic activities, hence the word productive. So this is our first site, and here we asked residents to partner with us from the beginning to help us make the decisions. But this wasn't something we did just as a kind of feel-good way of approaching our work. It was truly the only way to get anything done. Residents helped us get to know the chiefs, who helped us negotiate permissions for the land. They organized the community forums and workshops, and then eventually they designed and built and now manage the site and all of the small businesses that generate the sustaining income in those to maintain those sites. So here's that first site after, and it's evolved even more. There it is, over the 10 plus years. As you can see, they're very simple sites made with temporary materials. That's again because of the land, or semi-permanent materials, because of the land tenure concerns in Kibera. But over time, we've reclaimed 12 of these spaces and turned them into public spaces like these. Let's see, there we go. Sorry, it's a bit fuzzy. Each of these spaces has a really different set of amenities and infrastructural elements, and a whole range of economic activities, each of which respond uniquely to the expressed needs and vision of that community. So some spaces have a gabion system for flood retention, others have those plus bridges. A typical public space is home to some combination of a sanitation center, some sort of a constructed wetland, some drainage, as you see here, a multi-purpose hall, schools, kiosks, laundry areas, and then a whole range of small businesses. Some of the examples, sorry, it's slowing down a bit, of those businesses include things like, there we go, sorry. Things like small transportation businesses, craft businesses, and food provision in the form of greenhouses or other urban gardens. So this shared decision-making is, like I said, essential, but it also actually works. And you don't have to take my word for it. This is from The Guardian today, actually, and this is the story of another settlement not too far from Kibera that has been doing all of this community-led upgrading for decades now, and has just recently gotten to the level of scaling that kind of site-by-site, neighborhood-by-neighborhood work up to a planning ordinance that really begins to address the biggest concern of informality, which is the underlying land tenure. So without getting into the details, this is now the step that we are at with our work in Kibera, and the folks that have been leading this work in Mukuru is a long-term partner of ours, and we are bringing that same idea of some really large-scale planning changes. We're working on a similar project now in Kibera. Okay, so moving on, another way that we as designers can move into this challenge of uniting the divided city is by connecting our design interventions to policy change. So designers have to recognize, when we recognize this injustice and the racism that permeates the policies that are controlling the built environment, it then follows that we need to expand our scope to think about how we might change the policy environments, especially in the cases when they are the obstacle to really meaningful and needed design interventions. So I'll take an example from our work in the low-income communities of Los Angeles that illustrates this. So for a long time at KDI, we've been wrestling with this challenge in Los Angeles, that half of the city doesn't have equal access, easy access to a park. And the half that lacks access overlays almost perfectly with the LA's low-income communities of color. And at the same time, we know that building permanent parks in Los Angeles is anything but fast. So we were looking for ways to make quality public spaces available to people now, while also pursuing that long-term goal of permanent public spaces. So we called upon the thing that LA has plenty of, and these are city-owned vacant lots. These are lots that the city barely knew they owned and certainly had no way for residents or other groups to access them, let alone purchase them. But we knew, because there was no kind of easy political pathway to use these lots, that before we could dream up these wonderful interventions for how they could be repurposed, we needed to address this issue of access through policy. So we did that by first trying to provoke people's attention and provoke their understanding of the need for such kind of policy change. And we did that through design. So we did these temporary activations in lots like this, done for a weekend, designed by community members, and we would bring key individuals, make sure that politicians and any other decision makers were around to see what was possible. That built the political will and energy needed to then work at the policy level with the city council to change the way that people were able to use these lots. And so through a resolution, it allowed us to form this program called Adopt a Lot, where groups of residents or community members or nonprofit organizations can adopt any of these vacant lots that the city owns for up to 2 years and transform them into a wide number of uses that communities need most. So with that policy change, we were then able to design not just how the program would work, but also this kit of parts that could be used to temporarily activate the space while it was under adoption. And then we began to introduce a community design process by which residents could determine how they wanted that kit of parts to come together on the site. And over time, we now have 3 of these lots that have been developed and adopted. So as you can see, they're simple spaces, some gardens, play spaces, but they make a big difference in parts of the city where any type of a public space is lacking. Here's another lot, same sort of process. And again, after. This one opened in the pandemic. But what's important about this program is that those simple design interventions unlock the underlying challenge. They have been enough to now create this pathway to permanency. And so each of those lots that you saw there are now in a kind of pilot development process where these groups will purchase those lots for $1 from the city and be developed through a nonprofit development partner. And they will, in fact, become new permanent public spaces in communities that didn't have them. And though that process takes a while, all of the time spent in that process, the community has this temporary kind of provisional space to call home. Okay, so moving on, layering interventions. Let's be clear, any well-designed and well-directed contribution in the public realm should be applauded. But sometimes in places where the disinvestment and the harm and inequity is long-standing and cumulative, we as designers have to confront this reality that challenges like these aren't undone by a single project, no matter how wonderful that project is. And instead, we have to take this long view and understand that each of our projects should not be aimed at a single challenge, but instead at the intersection of many of these issues. And in doing so, think about projects that layer many objectives and benefits into them, but also layer projects on top of each other so that they begin to add up to having a sort of a systems impact on a community. So an example of that from our own work is our work in the Eastern Coachella Valley. So we started working there about 10 years ago, and at the beginning of that work, we set out to simply take that idea of a productive public space network that we had developed in Kibera and see if it was applicable and replicable in the Eastern Coachella Valley, given the similar conditions. And it turned out that it was very replicable, and we too have begun to build a network that's just opened our 3rd site and have a couple more in development. And these sites, like their counterparts in Kibera, were waste spaces, underutilized waste spaces that went through a community design process. Sorry about the lag there. And turned into these spaces that truly did not exist within a 20-mile radius of any of these communities. These are just a couple of pictures. This is our second site. This is the phase that, this is the second one that just opened a couple of weeks ago. The first phase of it opened. These sites become not just kind of important spaces for recreation and gathering, but they too are layered with economic activity and small businesses. Some of them allow for better water connections into the surrounding communities because they bring new sewerage and water trunks into the general region. So like Kibera, they provide kind of this infrastructural benefit, economic benefit, social benefit, all in one space. But in the Eastern Coachella Valley, we understood really quickly that parks weren't enough. Residents said to us, yes, these parks are fantastic. They're what we need, they're what we want. But this is a spread out kind of place, and there aren't buses, there aren't transit lines, and most of us have one car per household, if that. So for these parks to really be effective, we need a way to get to them. There are no sidewalks in the Eastern Coachella Valley. There are no street lights, and it's the desert. So thinking about how to connect these public spaces to make sure that they had their impact became the next layer of our intervention there. So just quickly, at a glance, you can see this is the condition of transit and mobility infrastructure in the East Valley compared to that of the West Valley. And again, through a community process, asking residents to say, where are the places you want to connect first, knowing that everything wasn't achievable overnight. And what do you want those sidewalks to look like? Those who were in the lecture earlier today when we were talking about not all sidewalks are created equal, importantly, in this case, residents told us up front that in fact they didn't want a traditional sidewalk. They wanted these paths that were more removed from the road, that were wider and more multimodal. And so the very element of infrastructure that was missing itself was designed in a radically different way because of going through this community process. But in short order, we developed these plans that were missing and were really the key to unlocking state funds to be able to build this infrastructure. We got these plans adopted by the county, which is the same county that is in charge of the West Valley, but had really neglected doing any sort of planning for the East Valley. And we've got the first phase of the first one funded and then went on to replicate this mobility planning in the neighboring communities. Then, of course, housing was a layer that you saw was missing, and again, through a similar process, we began to work with a larger design team on, this is 150 units of affordable housing in the area that also has a strong public space element that is public beyond just the users of the development. And then finally, there's a really kind of looming over everything is this environmental disaster at the Salton Sea that makes the occurrences of respiratory diseases in the East Valley something like 10 times that of the West Valley, leads to long-term respiratory illnesses, and all of that had just been neglected. So the last layer that we've added onto our initiative there is an advocacy and environmental justice campaign that again is working at the state level to change the way that the resources that are flowing to that problem are allocated and ensure that they also go to not just remediating the wildlife and the habitat, but also to addressing the public health problems that are also resulting as a part of this challenge. Okay, and then just two quick ones to close. This is in that same category of kind of looking at layering and intersections. This project is also in downtown Los Angeles, but it's at a very unique spot. This is the project of a well-known foundation in the area, but where their physical headquarters are located is at the intersection of many high-need communities. The low-income senior population in Chinatown, the unhoused community and the formerly unhoused community in and near Skid Row, and the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals from this Justice Corps that is just over here. So this site is a vacant site here that you see in the green, and it's meant to be the first catalytic site of a larger village plan, all of this kind of surrounding area. That's really meant to be what is thought of as a alternatives to incarceration village, a village that looks at restorative justice first, that looks at centering the needs of the unhoused, and in an addition that we've brought to the project, seeing how those needs intersect with the needs of the low-income Chinatown seniors that have been long overlooked in Chinatown. This project's in its very early stages, so there's not much to show yet, but we're really taking this idea of the ecotone and the tide pools that form as these moments of intersection for the project to meet overlapping needs of very different constituent communities. And in some cases, constituent communities that overlap, which is the case of the formerly unhoused and formerly incarcerated. So this project, again, through a community process, has kind of centered around, has come across these kind of 5 areas of layering that everything will range from housing to healing to learning and creation, all in the same site, because it really has to, by only doing one of those things, it really isn't getting at the heart of the problem. And so this idea of layering, which of course is not new to design or novel in any way, but thinking about it in the context of communities like these is really the only way to approach a project. And then the one I'll close with is a project that grew out of our original work in Argentina at the site that you all are looking at, that many of you are looking at over the weekend. So in Argentina, as I was mentioning earlier, at the highest level of government, there was a large investment about to be made by the World Bank in upgrading settlements across the country. But Argentina, being a forward-looking country, really trying to center the needs of women and really trying to move the needle on gender equity, asked us to come and look at the ways in which we might develop a participatory approach to upgrading that really centered gender, not just women's needs, but the whole range of the gender spectrum. And in that process, we conducted a kind of a 2-part study and intervention where we were looking at a particular settlement in Mendoza, La Favorita, the site of the weekend's work. And through that process, we centered on a plaza that became kind of a showcase, which I learned from the Google image that a student showed me today, is already in construction toward this new gender inclusive design. But what that work did was kind of show us that there really is a method to this madness. And part of the method is not about kind of how you change the bench or what you do to the shade structure that makes it more gender inclusive, but more than anything, it's the process that you take to get to those design decisions. And so from that work, the World Bank then commissioned us to think even broader about this idea. And we wrote this handbook for gender inclusive urban planning and design. And what the handbook does, besides offering you a set of guidelines, is really helps you understand the problem by collecting data and collecting information that isn't already a part of our current kind of dialogue around design. And so it's only once we understand the problem in ways that make, practical sense, that can be through economic terms or through social terms. It's only when you have the data to back up the severity of the problem that you can then convince decision makers to begin to put resources in that direction. So a lot of what this handbook does is literally make the case. It has these kind of arguments in it that global leaders or folks that are working within governments trying to make this change can use to convince their counterparts that design processes, planning processes need to move in a different direction. And then once that's done, then it gives you kind of a very practical methodology for how you approach that different process. And then finally, it moves on to talk about those kind of very specific design guidelines that helps you think about how you may reorient an entire design process to achieve equity and a different set of outcomes. So I look forward to working with those of you that are in the masterclass over the next several days as we take these ideas into our work. And even though you won't be able to carry out the same on-the-ground research, I hope that what you've seen here and some of the discussions that we've already been having will help you actively work to create these spaces that begin to blur that line between the informal and the formal and really begin to center equity in every design project, not just that you do this weekend, but that you do in all of your work going forward. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to a robust discussion. Perfect. Sure.
Where do they hold Coachella the Music Festival?
It's held in the city of Coachella. Actually, it's held in the city of Thermal, but it's in that region. It's about, from the sites that I was showing you, it's maybe 10 minutes.
By car?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm from New York, we don't have the concept of cars. Down packed, so I just had to clarify.
Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry, I'm having just a little trouble hearing you. Yeah, we have done so in Kibera as well. I just needed to make a short selection of projects to share. But one way that we've done it in Kibera has a lot to do with infrastructure. So, and actually this connects to the last point too about data. So in Kibera has really severe challenges of flooding. And there's an entire department within the municipal government that's meant to look at the challenges of flooding in the city. But one of the biggest problems and why there had been none of the investment of those resources into, sorry, let me just plug that in. So though there was an entire team and a lot of resources meant to address flooding, they seem to always be flowing to the formal part of the city and not the informal part of the city. So you could just say, oh, well, that's kind of like, them being like neglecting the informal city, but it's not really that simple. Nairobi does make efforts to, especially now, to meet the needs of Kibera residents and the other informal settlements. But the problem in this case was data. So there was lots of flood modeling, lots of data on rainfall and flood hotspots in the formal parts of the city, but none in the informal parts of the city. And so what we needed to do was change the way that resources were distributed so that some of the pot of money was also reaching Kibera. That was the kind of the policy change that we wanted. But to do that, we had to first round out the story. So we had to do a lot of just basic mapping and data collection in a way that began to create the same kind of flood maps and the same kinds of modeling that's used for resource allocation across the rest of the city in Kibera. And once we were able to put those on the table alongside all of the others, that policy change was actually pretty easy to achieve. And so now there is a process by which this municipal agency uses the data that we as KDI and residents helped us create to identify those hotspots, many of which turns out aren't even along the river, that the flooding is coming from drainage issues in the interior of the settlement, never would have been known without that mapping. And now, not only are the resources now directed there, but once they're directed there, the process by which a bridge is determined, like where it will be located or what it will be like, is through a community-driven process. And so that's just one example of how we were able to kind of leverage our work as designers to change policy that then allowed us to make the physical interventions that we wanted to see made. Some of the bridge pictures that you saw are examples of those. Yeah.
So when you were speaking about Iberia, it seemed like you were looking at the larger system, so not only addressing the physical infrastructure for change, but looking at the social economic, trying to cultivate systems that allow empower the community, help them thrive post intervention. Do you find that same opportunity is existing in the East Valley and in LA? Are there more barriers given the context?
Yeah, we do find the same opportunities, but they look different. So, for example, in Kibera, the only way to make this public space network work and exist is by embedding those economic pieces into each public space. The space has to generate enough revenue for it to pay for itself. Otherwise, it's reliant on donor funding forever, which is never a feasible strategy, or it falls into disrepair and gets kind of put to a different use. So there it was sort of essential. And so there's a big focus on it, and it's actually it's one of the most complicated parts of our work and also the hardest. In the Eastern Coachella Valley, the same kind of needs around income generating opportunities, and actually same in Los Angeles around the Adopt-A-Lot. But what's driving it is a little bit different. None of the public spaces in the Eastern Coachella Valley are kind of self-funded through a community process. They're all, we've made all of them happen by kind of, not forcing because they've been willing partners, but provoking these dialogues with the Parks and Rec Department and kind of making it impossible for them to say no to putting in the efforts of developing parks in these places. We've done that by offering kind of, in the first project, we offered the design services as sort of the seed and offered to help with the kind of funding processes. And then it worked so well that by the second time, the second park, they offered to pay us for our work. And then took on the economic burden on their own, and same with the subsequent parks. So all of those parks are maintained through a Parks and Rec department once they're built. So the income generating opportunities, or the focuses in the Eastern Coachella Valley, it's a lesser focus because it's not critical to its survival, but it is critical in terms of needs of the community. So for example, the businesses look like there's two women's food cooperatives that have taken kind of their talents of making traditional Mexican street foods and turned them into kind of small catering businesses or the concession stands in these parks. they've sold, they sell at the Coachella Music Festival every year, those kinds of things. So that work exists throughout all of our projects, but it's like to different levels of necessity and kind of different levels of like focus in an overall project. Mm-hmm.
From the Zoom audience.
Sure.
So first one, what aspects of your approach and tools would you recommend to also be used by planners working in community settings with more formal infrastructure?
All of them. I don't think it matters so much. I think even in the most formal, well-planned, well-designed neighborhood, if you actually talk to the people that live there and use it and bring them into the decision-making process, it's guaranteed to be a better project. You can probably point to things all over this campus, for example, that actually, I won't say it out loud, but I saw one myself walking around this afternoon and kind of heard the story of something that's really beautiful and not what the users of this campus actually wanted or needed. So I would say all of those, all of these ideas are equally applicable in the most formal part of a city. Yeah. Oh, I think someone just said it. Did I hear a whisper? Seating, plazas, benches, chairs, things like that. Does that help?
Not at all. Oh, the $2,000 chairs.
I don't know. No, I'll say it this way. There's beautiful benches all around the new, I don't know if it's called a quad, but the new.
There are many quads.
Sorry? The East End. But what I understood is that once there were kind of a layer of chairs put into the plaza that were movable, that people could do what they wanted, that really began to meet the seating and gathering needs better than perhaps that first layer of just benches did.
Yeah, those chairs are rumored to cost like $2,000, and it's a piece of metal. So, I think that's what you're alluding to.
Got another question from Diane Montana. Have you encountered any pushback from power breakers that profit from infrastructural inequality?
Yes. The cartels, yes, in every project, and not just in Kibera. That also, there's a version of it that happens in the eastern Coachella Valley, even in Los Angeles, certainly. The cartels, the water cartels in Kibera are perhaps the most vivid example. Every new site is meant to kind of add a new connection to the city water infrastructure. But of course, the more city water infrastructure connections that exist, the less margin of, the less of a monopoly the cartels are able to exert. So our approach has been to work with the cartels and kind of build these long-term relationships and agreements that get the job done, and that has been far more effective than for example, the larger municipal water agency, their approach to the cartels, which has kind of been a more like absolutist. We can't acknowledge your existence. We can't acknowledge the provision of water that you've been giving for the last couple of decades, and so that kind of looking for those in-between spaces that don't ask you to kind of compromise your integrity or your ideals, but recognize that in some ways the cartels were stepping in for an absence of government that was 100% needed and providing a very valuable service, and to recognize that their role in making the informal city a habitable place is kind of the way that we approach those conflicts. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear more about the Coachella Valley project as it scales up. I ran a studio a number of years ago where we went out and we met with had this amazing water infrastructure tour with the Coachella Valley Water District.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But also met with the Agua Caliente tribe that tried to understand the issues of land ownership and the
Yes.
relationship to that. So in terms of those two like big brokers out there, how does it work like with, I mean, maybe there is an answer to this, but in terms of like the land ownership and then the kind of insanity of water management as it scales up to the aquifer and the aqueduct and all that, how does that impact and come back down to the communities you're working with, or do you even go there?
We do go, I mean, that was kind of the last layer of this Eastern Coachella Valley initiative. It's where we are now. And we've been working there for maybe 10 years. And I would say we've just kind of taken this last layer into the work in the last 3 or 4 years. Yeah, it's so complex, but let me see how I can give kind of a simple answer. What it took, I don't know that we could have waded into it in year one, because what we're doing now, and we're not doing it alone, we're doing it with a coalition of a bunch of other nonprofits, though we're the only one that really has a kind of built environment perspective within the coalition. But what we're doing is we are trying to be in the middle of all of that complexity and mess, and we're trying to untangle it in the practical ways, in 2 practical ways. There's kind of this, people have finally recognized the intensity of the problem, and this is at the state level, even at the federal level. So there's finally resources coming in to deal with water, the Salton Sea, all of these other things. But the problem is, as I mentioned, is the way what these resources were going to do were just bizarre, like creating a lake within a lake, or just these crazy engineering schemes that who knows if they had any chance of like even working, let alone being what people needed. So we are in these, very bureaucratic processes of like getting people on water boards, getting people into these steering committees, and wading into rewriting language within regional plans for housing elements or development, like just really, really mind-boggling and like hard, dense stuff. But we are, only because we've been there so long, and this is that idea of layering and sticking around, that not only could we even understand it, but that we have any leverage to do anything about it. And so coming into that process after having demonstrated success or having some facts on the ground that have shown how we could expand water infrastructure. So for example, one of the parks I showed extended a big water main of the Coachella Valley Water District, and then was able to become a trunk to then feed all of these other trailer parks in the area. So demonstrating our ability to kind of get some real on-the-ground things done that begin to improve these overall conditions through a participatory process gave us leverage in this highly bureaucratic world to say, we know how to do this. And if you let us influence your process, you will achieve better outcomes too. And so the way that's practically playing out is some of these crazy ideas, like the lake within the lake, or the, sea to sea pipeline, like those are no longer the dominant ideas where all of the funding is definitely going to go. People are questioning them. They're bringing residents into the processes to say, like, what do you think about this? And I think where hopefully that leads is that ultimately all of this investment that is coming in isn't going to be squandered. It's going to actually meet the needs of the people that are there now. and not just kind of look to be these sort of speculative development investments. I don't know how that was for an answer.
No, it's crazy. It's crazy complicated, but it's also interesting, actually the way you frame the West Valley or versus the East Valley and vice versa, but the fact that water infrastructure system is just one, it's the whole valley.
Exactly.
From the replenishment down to the aquifer. So it's tricky, but it's interesting to see how you scale that back up and realize that it's one unit.
Yes.
That has to be negotiated.
Yes.
Like you just can't say there's one over here, one over there.
Yeah.
The conversation's going to have to happen.
Yes.
That you're part of the same water system.
Yes, and it's even more complex because it's two counties. So West Valley, East Valley, and Riverside County, but then part of that same system is Imperial County, and which is then kind of the border county. So
Yeah, and it's Colorado River water.
exactly.
That's
I saw another hand. Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about like the participatory aspect of your work a lot, and I'm really interested in that process. And I begin to kind of, all of the participants have varying ideas, and then there's the things that are plausible and not plausible. So how does that process work to where you start with these kind of speculative ideas and whittle them down to the actual needs and the process without, causing too much conflict? Because if you've been to any town hall meetings in the U.S., there can be a lot of differing opinions, and it's very difficult to kind of deal with sorting all those out and all the stakeholders being happy with the results.
Yeah, a great question. And I guess a couple of overarching things is one, it's never, I guess you're never really looking, well, two things I'll say. One, it takes time and it takes resources. And I think the biggest mistake that as designers or people who kind of set up these processes is that they don't plan for either, not from a budget perspective or from a time perspective. So generally that engagement is like, something that has to be done as part of a long checklist, but it isn't really given the space and time that it needs in a project work plan or in a project budget to be meaningful. So if you want to really get into those conflicts and try to come out the other end with something that really does add value to a design process, you have to first give it the time to let it get messy and let it get complicated. And so that's really the only way that we take on participation. It's never quick, it's always complicated. But the other thing that I would say about it is that you kind of have to not see your role as a designer as this kind of passive translator. Like, oh, my job is to just hear what everyone says and figure out a way to get all of that in the plan. It's not that, or at least in my opinion, it's not that. We too bring something to the table as designers and planners. We have a technical expertise, we may have kind of a political know-how, we may have our own other outside experiences, but the thing that we're able to do, I think, really well is think in terms of systems, take kind of nuggets of ideas, needs, and wants, and think about how those get translated beyond the obvious idea, the kind of most obvious way of getting there. And what we find a lot is when you take that role seriously, you may hear, like at face value, 10 different things from people in a workshop. I wish I could think of a good example quickly, but you may hear 10 different words. But if you're doing your job as a designer and you're really listening and you know how to interpret systems, et cetera, what oftentimes happens is like those 10 people weren't actually saying 10 different things. They were probably just saying 2 or 3 different things. They were just saying them in different ways or getting at them in different ways. And so then you can do your work to kind of bring those ideas together, maybe narrow them down a little bit more, translate them into something maybe even more creative or out of the box than what you're actually hearing. And generally, by the time you've done all of that and you bring it back to the same 10 people that thought they were saying 10 different things and present it to them for feedback, you don't have 10 people disagreeing with each other. Everyone's kind of seeing a piece of what they said or what they were asking for in that design. And that sounds like the most ideal situation, but it does really happen more times than not that way. Sometimes it doesn't, and you just have a big mess. But most of the time, if you take an active role as a designer and add your own value to the process, and you give yourself time, you really do get through those things in a much better place than where you started. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I think it's really interesting to see that the public space combined with different programs in Kibera, the informal settlement. So I heard that there are lots of complexity in Kibera, like the tribal conflicts with the trash and flood. And I wonder, like, if you plan to or intend to continue transform the informal settlement from to upgrade program project or is there?
Yeah, and that was kind of getting to this idea of like, it's not just about one design project. So we've, since we first started, we were like just a couple of people, and now we're 50 or 60 people. And even still, with our growth, with our ability to scale, we will still never, as a single firm, transform the face of Kibera physically. So we have to really think about like how we get the leverage through our work to bring that scaled change into the equation without having to try to like do it all ourselves. And so that's the example that I showed, the Guardian newspaper headline. That's a good example of where we're headed in Kibera. So we've built these 12 spaces, we've done a lot of flood infrastructure, we've built a lot of bridges, we've helped these groups start a lot of small businesses, and importantly, start this network that networks, about 500 leaders that run each of the sites into this one kind of more powerful voice for change within Kibera. But still, at the heart of all of that, like to deal with the water, the sanitation, the housing tenure at a larger scale, you have to engage the powers that be. And we've been building those relationships with all of the municipal agencies and with all of the county governments for a long time. And we're just now at the point, 10 plus years later, where again, like the Eastern Coachella Valley story, we have this leverage, and it's not just us, it's us, residents, other groups we work with, to put forward these big ideas that aren't like, let's build another 20 public spaces. It's let's take all of Kibera, create this special planning area. I won't bore you with planning jargon, but in doing this very technical thing that's on paper and like not really design at all, that's the way that we will do those things, like deal with the sanitation once and for all, deal with the sewerage across the entire settlement and not just in our little neighborhood where one of our sites happens to be. And of course, deal with the land tenure issue, which is the thing that makes even our own projects, as impactful as they may be, precarious and not always certain. So it's really about thinking about how you kind of start small and leverage that work well.
Thank you. May I ask one more question?
Sure.
So I think from architecture background, I'm just curious that in those projects, how the architecture and urban plan designers they play a similar role or different roles in the design process.
Yeah, great question. And especially in our firm, because we work at a lot of different scales. So you saw in the Adopt a Lot project, we're designing like Lego-like furniture, right? And then at some of these other scales where it's like a 30-acre site, and some it's kind of a whole regional plan. So I would say one thing that remains constant is that in all of those projects, there's an interdisciplinary team in our office. So if you were an architect in our office, you would be on that tiny project, like at the furniture scale project and at the regional scale project, alongside not just a planner or other design professionals, but alongside people from our community team, which are community organizers, kind of sometimes folks with humanities backgrounds. And beyond whatever your technical role is, depending on what the project is, we really rely on kind of that diversity of thought or perspective or approach to a problem to be critical to the solution-making process. So sometimes architects are on projects in our office working alongside, a planner, and it's very straightforward. It's like the planning team's working on the site plan, and the architect or the landscape architects are, working on the buildings and the landscape respectively. But a lot of times it's much messier than that, and everyone's a part of the community engagement process as the architect, the planner, and the community organizer. And then you all kind of move into the design process, but you're shifting who's taking the lead role versus who's more of an advisor in the process.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, one follow-on question. So it's a beautiful presentation and sort of a mainstay in 3 locations, and there's seemingly a never-ending complexity of layers that will connect. Have you thought about exit strategies, or how you pass off some of this work? And
Yeah.
where you hand off and what you take on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is something we've been talking about really from day one, and especially in Kibera, because at the beginning, we had a really kind of strong position that we didn't want to do it all. So especially with the economic development stuff, once we knew that we needed income generation at these sites, we thought, well, we can't do that, so we need a microfinance partner, and we need this kind of partner, and we worked really hard at the beginning to find that partner. And what we found through a lot of false starts is that it was very hard for these other kind of specialized groups to, integrate what they do into this kind of more layered approach to things. And so in the case of Kibera, we had to kind of take on more than we really wanted to, and it has stayed that way. I would say that in Kibera, of all of the places where we work, that's the hardest place to, our exit strategy now is the work that we're doing at the planning scale of this special planning area that would truly hand these bigger systems efforts off. I mean, not that we're the ones driving them now, but we would know that they were still progressing, and we wouldn't kind of be the centerpiece of moving them. But even just with our network of 12 sites, thinking we don't support the sites financially. They are all financially self-sufficient, but because from the very fact that we still have an office in Kibera, at the edge of Kibera, we're still very kind of tied up in the each group's existence. And we do have kind of we're in a few-year exit strategy process there. We want to kind of get to this point where we probably won't build a lot more public spaces within that network because of all the changes that are physically happening in Kibera, and it's not, there's a lot of risk now to continuing to build the network. But we want to ensure that everything that exists within the network remains intact. And so there's a lot of focus on training and infrastructure development among these groups so that they are their own network, which they are already, but kind of bolstering that to the place where we know we can exit. In the other places, each intervention is pretty, it doesn't really require an exit strategy. Like I've been talking about these projects in a way that it kind of focuses on our role, but in almost all of these projects, it's not just us. We're already part of this like network of people getting the stuff done. And so it's more about, we actually aren't trying to exit the geographies. We're just trying to exit each step of the process or each layer of work that we're doing. And I would say we're much more successful at it in California than we have been in Nairobi. Or it's just taken us a lot longer to get good at it in Nairobi. Yeah.
Corollary to that, for like mentoring strategies, have you left communities that are kind of the best for your work, and have you distinguished when communities might not be able to kind of integrate well with, I don't know.
Yeah. Another good question. So and the answer is evolving as we evolve and grow as a firm. In the beginning, all of the places we worked were just kind of, not coincidence, but they were based on connections and relationships. So Kibera, one of our co-founders, was from Kenya. It was supposed to be a 2-week student research project. We went there because he lived there, and then that's how we ended up staying in Kenya. In the Eastern Coachella Valley, a colleague and friend of mine said, hey, it sounds like what you're doing. We were starting to look at where our model might be useful in the US. And a colleague said, hey, what's happening in the Eastern Coachella Valley sounds a lot like what you're describing in Kenya. I didn't really believe him, to be honest. I was like, yeah, sure, but it's not the same. And I just drove out there one day and started talking to folks. And in fact, it was exactly the same, to the point that 2 mothers on opposite ends of the world were telling me the exact same story about what it meant to live in a community with unpaved roads. So that's kind of the beginning state. Like the 2 places where we've been firmly rooted for the longest time have just come through things like that. And because we have this commitment to staying in place and layering, that's why we've been there. LA is where I'm from, and so to truly work in my own backyard, and that's where our office was a natural thing. And everything from that has come through this process of people come to us or groups come to us, and we try to evaluate our ability to do our work. We worked in Haiti for a little bit because folks invited us to work there, and that's a place where we realized unless we were going to build real infrastructure of a team there, that it wasn't a right fit for us because we didn't have the language capacity, just for a long list of reasons. So we did the couple of projects that we had been invited to help on, and we decided not to continue working there. And then just in the last few years, we had been saying no to almost anything that was like a one-off project in a place that we couldn't drive to. And just in the last few years, we've started to kind of explore, because there's been like a really good reason to. Folks, we've always kind of redirected people, like find the local group that's like us and do it with them. And then we started to hear in certain situations, well, it's a smaller city, that there's nobody that's working in this way, and so would you consider it? And so we started to kind of test, like, is there a way that we can still do this authentic participatory process with true sharing of decision-making power with residents in places where we have to fly in and out or, come in and out on this interim basis. And I'd say we're doing it, like we have projects right now in Colorado, in Philadelphia, starting a project in Kansas, and I'd say the jury's still out, but on some of those that we've been in for a couple of years now, I think we do have a way that we can do it meaningfully and well, but it's only because we basically rely on other partners that we can feel super confident in, that we kind of share an approach, share a vision. And in the cases where projects come to us and we can find that match, we're starting to say yes more. And in the cases where we can't find that, we're getting better at saying no.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.